the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful.
Prominent Western scholars have made very convincing arguments challenging the authenticity of God and the prophethood of Muhammad, peace be upon him. I understand that you disagree with their material and arguments, but what has led others to accept their message so readily these days?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. I think the question of being convinced with this argument or that argument in this case, as you mentioned, some people have been convinced with the arguments of this scholar or that author or that philosopher, is something natural. It has occurred before. One way to simply address that is to realize that there are also as many people, and sometimes a lot many more, who also were convinced with the arguments of the opposite side, that God exists. If you mention some names of those who rejected the notion of God, and we mentioned earlier why those notions scientifically by other scientists are untenable, if you mention that, then there is a galaxy of scholars and of scientists from earliest on until nowadays and through who have been convinced that God exists and have presented arguments rationally, scientifically, philosophically, let alone spiritually. Go back to the times of Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni was an excellent, great scientist. He's the one who measured the perimeter of Earth at that time, centuries ago, before the modern measurements of the perimeter of Earth almost to the same level. He's a person who believed in Allah and his Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ibn al-Haytham, upon whose shoulders the greatest thinkers of modern scientific methodology stood, believed in God, believed in Allah and his messenger. And go on, the great Ibn Rushd Averroes, who is considered the most influential Islamic figure on Western rational thinking, he's a person who believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger, and so on. Go to Einstein, he's a man who believed in God and presented his arguments, and you can go on the galaxy of scholars. So the fact that someone named a scientist believed, and we mentioned earlier, reasons are really not, as some scientists have said, are not really scientific or rational. They are more psychological. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
Okay, the next question is for Sheikh Nouman Ali Khan. Says, Muhammad, peace be upon him, lived 1400 years ago and could not even read or write. Yet Muslims hold his authority above that of world-renowned contemporary scientists and scholars. Where is the logic here?
Okay, so there's a lot of flaws in that question because you're comparing a messenger of God to a scientist. A scientist isn't asking people to be followed or to take his claims as the words of God, or nor is he asking you to reform your life in an ethical or spiritual way, etc. So what a scientist is simply doing is researching the universe. And the assumption that following the Prophet somehow contradicts following modern scientific research is absurd. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I think this problem occurs in many other faith traditions where science was seen as a threat. And the assumption is made that all religions must be this way, all religions must discourage scientific inquiry. But actually, Islamic history, as was already indicated just now, thank you, Sheikh, it has been one of very in-depth scientific inquiry and even pioneering in the field of scientific inquiry. Now, as for the Prophet being 1400 years ago and not having the kind of scientific knowledge and access that we have today, when it comes to matters of guidance, right and wrong, justice and injustice, scientific revolutions will not change that. Doesn't matter what kind of technology you hold, what is fair is still fair, and what's unfair is still unfair. Truth is still truth, and falsehood is still falsehood. Wronging people is still wronging people. So whether we live now or 300 years from now or 300 years before now, the principles on which we're supposed to live our life are timeless. And so they were given in a desert, and that desert educated the rest of humanity. And it gave life to the rest of humanity. And that's what we hold dear. We hold that revelation and that message dear, and that legacy.